Welcome back to Counterpoint. We were discussing Cuba and its fight for freedom. Is there hope here? Is there hope for the people who are constantly protesting and fighting and asking for their voice to be heard? We'll have to see. But joining me in studio to help give us some insights into what's happening there is Michael Lima Cuadra. Michael, again, thank you so much for joining me. Before we went to commercial break, we were discussing Canada's role and what it could be doing. Let's talk more about that. We're talking about the sanctions, the Magnitsky sanctions that we've seen imposed in other countries that Canada has imposed, and yet they haven't yet done so in Cuba. We've discussed what we could be doing. What other things would you like to see Canada implement or encourage when it comes to dealing with Cuba?
Canada has a big voice, has legitimacy in many international fora around the world. In the United Nations Human Rights Council, Canada has an important voice. Cuba, for example, now has over 1,100 political prisoners, one of the major humanitarian crises in Cuba. I think one of the steps Canada can take is to call for the release of political prisoners in Cuba. In the past, in 2018, there was an opportunity for Canada to vote on 8 resolutions presented in the Human Rights Council so that Cuba respect human rights on different points, freedom of association, freedom of the press. Yet Canada voted no for those resolutions.
They voted the wrong way.
They voted the wrong. They voted the same way that Syria and other authoritarian countries voted at that time. So many opportunities missed in terms of what Canada can be doing with Cuba. Say, for example, when Parliament talks these topics, they have different committees in which they discuss human rights around the world. For many years, they haven't touched the topic of Cuba or invited people that are activists that are connected to human rights activists. They've invited major business that have lobbied the government to invest in Cuba. They've invited scholars that have medals in Cuba for their allegiance to the regime, to the dictatorship.
That's not good. That's not good.
So there should be a balance there.
Yeah.
There should be a balance.
I don't even think it should be a balance. I think we just have to be very clear of what this is. It's a communist authoritarian regime.
Exactly. And here voices, here perspective that help and reshape Canadian foreign policy.
Right.
The opposition movement in Cuba has called on Canada to do so. When I reached out to them, for example, the people-to-people diplomacy that Canada has with Cuba is mostly devoted to inviting people that are in the official positions in the regime, artists or people within the government, a scholarship center, but scholars that belong to the government are inserted, but not artists and human rights activists. There is an artist in Cuba, Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, who was denied a visa for Canada. I think it was in 2016.
Why?
He was invited by the OCAT, by the university in Toronto, and for reasons that I don't know, he was denied a visa. And he would be an example of the people-to-people diplomacy that Canada can engage and make it more broad, not just they cannot expect that Cuba that a government represents Cuba. Cuba is a plural society represented by many.
Well, especially when you have over 600,000 who've left in just a few years. I don't want to be too political, but they're saying there might be an election coming up in the next 6 months in Canada, a surprise election. The Conservative Party rather seems to be polling quite high. Do you have higher expectations for outcomes if what looks like the polls indicate now that it would be a Conservative majority government here in Canada?
I've spoken with numerous MPs from the Conservative Party. They have supported the cause of democracy in Cuba. I've spoken with Michael Chung. He's supportive, for example, of targeted sanctions. He once mentioned that would be a possibility had the Conservative Party win a majority in a future election. The leader of the party, Pierre Poilievre, I've heard him, and his language with respect to Cuba is different. He's supported free elections in Cuba, which have departed from the current language. But what I would hope is that either Conservative or any government would back those words with actions.
Yes.
Like Canada has a lot of tools in his diplomacy, his foreign policy that he can use with Cuba. I mentioned targeted sanctions could be one The topic of political prisoners, I think that would be the most concerning for many thousands of Cuban families calling for the release of political prisoners. Those are steps that Canada can undertake in terms of supporting the pro-democracy movement in Cuba.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have to talk more about this. We're going to be back in just a few moments from this commercial break, and we'll pick up this conversation on Cuba.